Hello, and welcome to Let's Just Talk. I'm your host, Hami. Today, we're joined by Dr. Shankar Prasad to discuss the future of higher education. In other words, will colleges and universities continue to be relevant in the years to come? Dr. Prasad here is the Dean of the School of Professional Studies and the Vice President of Academic Innovation at Brown University. Dr. Prasad, welcome to Let's Just Talk.
Thank you, Hami. Great to see you. Great to see you all. Thanks for having me.
Of course. We're not going to waste any time. Let's start with the topic that's at the forefront of everybody's mind. The Supreme Court just overturned affirmative action, which is a policy that allowed universities to use race-conscious, what's the word I'm looking for? Race-conscious monitoring when they're bringing in new students, admitting new students into their colleges and universities. What is your take on this, and where do we go from here?
Yeah, it's a great question. And as you said, everyone is thinking about this right now. And so did it come as a surprise? Not really. I mean, for the last year or so, universities like ours have been thinking about the possible ways that the Supreme Court could rule on this decision. And we sort of have been contingency planning, frankly, in terms of how we could address it from here. So, you know, the ultimate ruling, again, as I said, wasn't a huge surprise. I mean, some of the stuff was interesting to see it. Overall, I mean, I think the key point here is that it's a pretty disappointing decision from my perspective, both as an individual and as somebody who works in a university. And, you know, it's something we have to contend with. I mean, the biggest disappointment is that I fundamentally believe that diversity is core to and sort of a driver of academic excellence. So being able to ensure that we can create and cultivate inclusive environments, but also increase compositional diversity in terms of who we actually bring into the classroom is incredibly important. And so the decision constrains the ability to do so in the ways that we have up to now.
So just to bring up what opponents of affirmative action were arguing, were that this is not actually inclusive, it's rather exclusionary and ends up favoring some groups over others. How do universities like Brown, Harvard, MIT rationalize the idea that we need to have a system in place that takes into account other factors such as race, gender, disability, and so on to admit students? How do you speak to people who don't see the value of affirmative action? How do you agree that this is actually a good thing for universities and for our society?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, so the reality is that this question has been asked a number of times, and we had the Grutter case 20-something years ago, right? And actually, there was a recent piece that came out in Inside Higher Education by the dean of the Michigan Law School, who was one of the parties to that case when it came out. And the point that he made at that time was that the argument to the court that ended up being in favor of Michigan's practices was that we live in a racially diverse society, right? And so we need to be fundamentally training our students to be able to not just coexist, but to engage with, to celebrate, to really become richer from the fact that every classroom that they sit in, every boardroom that they sit in, every instance of life that they're engaged with, they're engaging with people from many different backgrounds, right? Racially diverse backgrounds, socioeconomically diverse backgrounds, internationally diverse backgrounds. So understanding how to engage with individuals, to work with and collaborate with them is really important. And the reality is, if you just look at the numbers, right, we know that our boardrooms are not representative of the racial diversity in this country. Our corporate executive suites are not representative of racial diversity. Our classrooms, right, we're making progress, but we're still not there, right? And it takes active work to be able to demonstrate to do so. So both in terms of how we can train our future generations of students and leaders to be able to engage with the world as it is, demonstrates, I think, the importance of this work of affirmative action, and the just realities of the current numbers. Even with affirmative action in place, we still have not been able to realize the progress that we've wanted to see as a society. And so in both of those cases, I think it's a simple response that the decision, I think, is harmful, I think, to our ability to sort of address some of these concerns that I've raised.
Right. And so Brown is definitely one of the most diverse places I've been to. And I've been to like other institutions, and it's just not the same. The School of Public Health has a Equity Scholars Program where they intentionally try to bring in students from HBCUs or underrepresented groups and communities. What happens to programs like that post the overturning of affirmative action? And then what do you say to opponents who argue that, not even argue, try to scapegoat black youth and black students and say that universities like yours are letting in less qualified applicants. Is this the case, or are you actually just being intentional in the way in which you recruit qualified students?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, let me take the second question first and just say unequivocally, fundamentally, that is not the case, right? That we are not sacrificing the quality of a student's background because we have to sort of meet these targets or because we're trying to achieve sort of diverse populations. The reality is that when we look at students, we're looking at them as holistic individuals, right? We're looking at their leadership, we're looking at their backgrounds, we're looking at the obstacles that they have overcome, and frankly, that sometimes is relevant or related to sort of their racial diversity, and sometimes it's not, right? But the reality is the students who are coming to a place like Brown, the students who are able to come to a place like Brown, the students who should come to a place like Brown but cannot because of the barriers that they're confronting are all very different things. And so we need to be able to acknowledge that the types of students that we want to be able to recruit may not come from sort of this narrow pathway that has been historically true. They didn't go to the best prep school or the best private school, right? They didn't come from a place that had 15 college counselors to be able to support them through their college search process. They didn't come from families where they're one of 5 siblings or one of three generations of people who have been able to do this. So the track to be able to get into a school is something that is known, right? We need to be able to get to those students who don't have those kind of resources, right? But who are fundamentally brilliant and talented and make Brown a much stronger place. Being able to intentionally go and search for those students, I think, is what this policy, what our practice, our mission standards have been up to this point. So just, again, unequivocally, I do not see this as a zero-sum game. Either you're diverse or you are qualified. You are qualified because I think in many ways you are
of all those other factors.
Because of these other factors.
And so then what happens to programs like the Equity Scholars Program, or like what's next?
Yeah.
What do you all do from here? Because all of the presidents of various universities have put out statements about we'll do this and we'll work towards this, but no concrete plans as to like what this post affirmative action world looks like.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, this is the nature of policy. You're a policy graduate, so you know that now we're in the stage of implementation, right? So we now have some sense of kind of what the court's decision is and some of the sort of broad framework what the policy should look like. Everything now is trying to figure out, okay, how do we ensure that we are following the law? Right? We have to as an institution, but doing so in a way that does not compromise our singular commitment to diversity and inclusion. And so it's a little bit, I think, a work in progress right now. I mean, it's relatively new. We're sort of as a team working tirelessly with the university leadership to figure out how we can continue to sustain programs like the Health Equity Scholars Program. Part of me believes, and just personally, we haven't made a decision as a university, part of me believes that, you know, what we want to start to think about is that who can apply to such programs shouldn't be restricted based on who you are and where you come from, right? So there shouldn't be sort of a racial predeterminator for who can apply to these programs. But what we want to start to do is to look at students based on their commitment to and ability to address inequality and inequity across these different categories, whether it's financial or whether it's generational or whether it's racial, et cetera. So that's one of the things that we can do. So we can open a broader pool of applicants. And I think that's not a bad thing, right? Because if we're going to address some of the inequities we talked about at the start of this session, we have to do so collectively, right? Regardless of racial background.
And then pivoting a little bit, the increasing price tag of universities in the United States is ridiculous. Like, how much does it cost to attend a program at Brown?
It ranges, you know, somewhere like $60,000 to $70,000, depending on which program. Some higher, some lower.
That's insane. So, this price tag allows universities to be competitive. At least that's one of the things that I read about in the scholarship. And a lot of scholars are arguing that it is simply unsustainable in the long term. What happens when we hit the 100K and like keep going up and keep going up? And so, how do we address this? And as we know, the Supreme Court also overturned Biden's plan to cancel student debt. Where do you stand on that, or where there's universities like yours and people who are in these decision-making powers and places? How are you guys thinking about this price tag, and how are you thinking about student loan debt and so on?
Yeah, so let me say a couple things about it. And I think it's a really important thing. I mean, I'll say just as an individual, part of the reason I took on this deanship a year ago, on July 1st, 2022, was one, I love Brown, but two, because I believe that universities have an obligation to be able to create pathways of access to students, regardless of their financial means, their backgrounds, where they're from in the world, right? And so there's a lot of innovation that's happening based on the technologies we've put in place to sort of reduce these barriers. The format of programs and the way that we actually teach, so the pedagogical delivery, to be able to create more pathways of access. And we're doing a ton as a university to think about ways that we could create financial accessibility, right?
Right.
So everything from rethinking the cost of tuition, so the price of attendance to an institution like ours, to the level of aid that we're able to provide to our students, to partnerships that we have with organizations that provide scholarships and other types of merit funding. So we are, I certainly, that's the thing that gets me out of bed every day, is that I want any student anywhere who deserves to come to a place like Brown, because
Right.
it's such an extraordinary place, should be able to come here, and it shouldn't
Right.
depend on sort of your background. So I think that's one just fundamental thing that, super, super important for us to do. I'll say two other things. I think it's really important to remember there's a distinction between what the actual price tag, right, that's attached to a degree is, and what the actual cost of attendance is, right?
Okay.
So we know this at the undergraduate level. Yes, the tuition is something high, like 70. I don't know the exact number now, but the reality is we're a need blind institution, right? We're working to becoming internationally need blind as well. We've already announced that as a university. So the goal here is to say, regardless of whether, like, what your financial background does, we want to make sure that we're able to provide means for you to be able to come here. So many of our students get full funding to be able to attend here. Many of our students get partial funding and whatnot. So that's the undergraduate level. We're now working at the graduate level to figure out a financial model that makes sense as well. I think the second thing I just want to point out, and it's an important thing to recognize, is that fundamentally cost of education is high. But when we look at a university like ours with the resources that we're providing, it actually costs us more oftentimes to be able to provide the education than what we're actually charging for tuition, right? So there's an already inherent subsidy that we provide in the process. So I need to work harder and harder to figure out how to continue to bring the cost down.
So the problem is not with universities like Brown and Harvard, who have crazy endowments that's like the size of the GDP of like an entire small island or small country, right? The problem is more with these smaller universities who have insane price tag as well, because they need to compete with universities like yours.
Yeah.
Are those models sustainable? What does the future of the American education system look like if they need to keep increasing their prices to compete with you?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Because they don't have the same endowment as yours.
Well, I think it's really important. So one of the things, and I'll speak now again about the programs that I oversee, which is a bunch of master's programs, right? Really excellent master's programs. We spent a lot of time and are spending a lot of time trying to determine what are the professional prospects, the career prospects of our graduates, right? We want to be able to ensure that we are not saddling our graduates with generational debt, right? Based on the programs that they attend. So we want to be able to ensure that we have incredible programs that serve the public good, like a public policy or a public health degree, right? But that our graduates, that the cost of tuition, right, is matched to what we think that the average sort of salary of these individuals are going to be, so that students can immediately get out the gates and succeed. So that's just an important thing to acknowledge when we think about sort of pricing within our university, or is sort of how I think about it. What do other universities do? Fundamentally, I think there's this sort of, arms race towards sort of tuition standards from here. I think that that's challenging. And I think that as a society, we need to take a step back and recognize that burdening our students with this kind of generational debt is something that is bad for everybody. And it actually leads me to some of the other things as I was thinking about the kind of future of higher education. I also think that the model of higher education needs to change, right? So this idea that you graduate when you're 17, 18, 19, and you suddenly need to know what you're going to do for the rest of your life. You jump into a college experience, you take on an extraordinary amount of debt, you squeeze out 4 years, right, at best. And then you aren't really you're not ready to take on sort of a professional setting. You don't even know what you want to do, but you've taken these expensive courses in a major that you're not even sure that you're really committed to. That doesn't really make sense right now, right? And so one of the things that I think our institutions are thinking a lot about is, what does sort of the future of the American workforce look like? What the future of the global workforce look like? And how do we start to train our students for that, right?
And then speaking of workforce, we have programs like Year Up that are actually training and giving technical expertise to a lot of students as an alternative to the high cost of attending colleges. And so does the future of the American workforce look more like intentional certificate and training programs as opposed to universities who are grandfathered in?
Yeah, I think it's such a compelling question. So, I think there's really interesting models. You look at the UK, you look at Germany, right? And there's like these really strong traditions of vocational training, right? So I think that on the one hand, I really like the idea of partnering with extraordinary organizations like Europe, right? Because what they're doing is that they're helping students get exposed to skills that they can then test out readily in jobs and test to see if that's something that they want to do. I don't think that that's zero sum, right? Or that therefore in doing so, you can therefore avoid sort of going to college. And I'll say part of the reason I think that is that one of the things we focus on at Brown through all of our programs is sort of this ethos of a liberal arts education, right? And when I think about liberal arts, and I often talk to parents around the world about what that actually means, what we're effectively doing is teaching our students how to do creative thinking and creative problem solving. And I think that's really compelling. And so this is why our students, we encourage them and we strongly create pathways for them to take a course in the humanities while they're taking a course in data science. And we have them take a course in anatomy while taking a course in the arts. And because I think at the intersection of these disciplines and these different courses, you start to think creatively about ways that you can address a problem from there. Last year or 2 years ago, I had the opportunity to go to Singapore, and I was meeting with one of the large banks, and we were talking about graduates and what this very large bank would want to see from graduates like ours, from schools like ours. And the CEO there had said very compelling, he's like, the reality is I don't want to hire a bunch of human calculators who are really good at some very concrete technical task, because frankly, computers are going to be able to replace that, right? What I want are the people that are going to come here and say, here's a bunch of stuff that's been happening. What are we not seeing, right? How are we thinking about the problems that we haven't even anticipated yet, right? How are we going to train our students? The dean of the College of Business at University of Illinois recently asked this question: how do we train our students for the industries that don't exist yet, for the challenges we haven't even foreseen, right? For the jobs that we've never even thought of, right? And seeing generative AI coming out and sort of how it's quickly, rapidly changing the landscape immediately sort of puts a punctuation to that point.
So how are universities thinking about the technologies that are coming to replace or that are coming to enhance, right? ChatGPT, Google's Bard or Board or whatever it's pronounced. And so how are you thinking about that technology and jobs for the future? Are you thinking about I know, because a lot of faculty are thinking about how does this fit into their courses? Is it plagiarism if students use ChatGPT to write essays or generate citations and so on? So what does the future look like with technological developments and advancements?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the right question, right? So I think it would be silly and if not catastrophic to sort of plug your ears and pretend that technology isn't coming and isn't going to change the way that we teach. And so to ignore Gen AI as we sort of do the work that we do would be, I think, problematic for institutions like ours. I think there's an opportunity to lean in. I mean, we have taken, the pandemic taught us, right, that institutions have an opportunity to fundamentally rethink who they serve and how they serve them through the way that we teach and learn, engaging with technology in a more successful way. And that has really fundamentally, I think, changed the landscape of higher education. And I think generative AI is another opportunity for us to do so. So last week on Tuesday, McKinsey's higher education practice brought together about 30 higher ed leaders from the private sector, from universities like ours and MIT and Boston College and others, folks that were coming in from consulting practices to exactly about this question. And really what we did was start to lay out a menu of like, what are the ways that we're seeing use cases that are interesting? So for example, we're seeing organizations that are coming out with ways of using generative AI to help teachers evaluate written work so that it's a way to sort of augment, particularly for public schools in this country where there's really large imbalances between the teacher-student ratios. It's a way to help augment the kind of teaching and pedagogical practice. There are ways for us to think about how we can use it as a teaching tool. So in my class in the policy course this fall, we're going to be spending some time thinking about how we can use ChatGPT as actually a teaching tool. So have our students encourage them, right, to use ChatGPT to come up with different ways to kind of construct statements, policy sort of policy theories around sort of these prompts, and then figure out how to evaluate sort of what makes sense based on, as you learned in our class, some of the other sources of influence based on where we think there's going to be stakeholder support, how you think about the kind of institutional constraints. So certainly not going to replace the way that we teach and what we do. I think it could very much enhance what we teach and do, and that's, I think, one of the experiments we want to test out.
Thank you for that. And then I have some facts here for you. In 2018, Program for International Student Assessments, which tests 15-year students in reading, math, and science, the United States ranked 38th in reading, 24th in math, and 25th in science, showing a decline from 2009, where the United States ranked 25th. And then in the United States, in relations to STEM, according to the 2022 Global Innovation Index, the United States ranks 5th in the world in terms of the number of engineers and scientists produced, lagging behind China, India, the United Kingdom, and I believe the third one is escaping me. What does the future of the American workforce look like if it looks like relative to our competitors, it is declining? What can universities do to showcase that they can still produce future leaders and change makers relative to the competitors globally?
Yeah, great question, Ami. So I would say there's probably a couple different ways to answer that. So one, I would separate your first question, I think, because I think that actually talks a little more about the public education, the state of public education, right, in a K through 12 system. So there's opportunities for universities like ours to lean in and partner with community colleges to think about encouraging mentorship programs. We do this now at Brown. We work with our Providence public school system to think about ways that we can provide, augment sort of teaching and learning and help our teachers who are incredibly burdened in public schools by helping bring some of our students, some of our faculty, some of our staff to be able to provide resources support there. So I think K through 12 is probably a very different question, and one that is, I mean, the data is incontrovertible, right? It's something that we need to address, and it's not sustainable for us to compete in the global economy with those numbers as they are. At the undergraduate and graduate level, when we think about STEM education and preparing our students for the future of the workforce, I mean, I think it's important, again, just to reinforce this point, there's one thing to teach technical education and one thing to teach technical education in the context of a liberal arts curriculum. So I think that's really important. So when I hear those things, I think, there's opportunities for us to partner with large engineering programs around the world, right? And so thinking about collaboration with these schools to be able to support this kind of education in a way that is accretive to the larger goals of a liberal arts curriculum, I think is important for us. I think there's opportunities for us to encourage our students to pursue these programs as well. I mean, we do a pretty good job. And Brown was one of the oldest engineering programs in the Ivy League and in the country. One of the really exciting things that we see here is that we have pretty we're almost at parity in terms of gender representation of female and male identifying students pursuing education in STEM and particularly in engineering. That isn't the case around the world. So making sure that we are also promoting the idea that individuals who come from different backgrounds may not see themselves in the STEM education is something that I think we want to address as well. So I think there's just so many ways to address a question like that.
Right. And I think a place that we lag behind is that the disparities start, like you said, at a very young age, where funding for schools, high schools, and public schools is based on your zip code. And if you come from low-income areas, your future is doomed before you can even make it to college, or your prospects are limited before you can even make it to college. Whereas if we want a strong future, a strong workforce, we need to ensure that all students from a young age have access to quality education so that we can remain competitive on a global market. But lastly, what are your hopes and dreams for the future of Brown as the dean and the innovator for the university?
Yeah, great. Well, first of all, I loved your point. That's exactly right. We need to make sure that every student sees themselves in the kind of future of work and these exciting jobs, doesn't close doors to themselves because they don't think that they could do math or science or engineering. So I 100% agree with you. Gosh, I mean, it is a really interesting moment in higher education. I mean, if I think about it, I've been in higher ed for almost 15 years now. I don't think of a time in the recent past where things have sort of come to a head, where you have rapidly shifting technologies requiring new skills. You've got new opportunities for education in multiple different platforms. We have to contend with affordability. We have to contend with other forms of accessibility. So what do I want? I want Brown to continue to be this extraordinary institution that it is, that brings brilliant students like you and others, that we can ensure that we break down these barriers of accessibility so that, again, as I said, students who should come here, who deserve to come here but couldn't otherwise come here, have the opportunity to do so. That's what I want. I mean, I think we continue to thrive as an institution because of the students that we bring from around the world.
Dr. Prasad, thank you so much for being on Let's Just Talk. It's been a pleasure, and we look forward to continuing this work with you.
Such a joy. Thanks for having me.